Thank you very much for those extremely kind introductions. And by the way, I'm still waiting for the headhunter check that you were going to send, a piece of your salary. But it is a great pleasure to be here in South Africa. It's 6 years since the last time I was here in your beautiful country, and having a wonderful experience. Again, it's a fantastic place to visit. And the people are just as wonderful as I remember from my last trip. Some of the infrastructure and policy and political issues that we'll mention today seem maybe to have gotten a little bit worse in some dimensions. You're the experts on that, and I look forward to learning from you this morning as we think through the topic of government failure. This is a topic I discuss with my students and colleagues in the US, but you know, when you talk about government failure in North America or in Europe, it's a little bit more of an abstract topic, right? What would it be like if government began acting in certain ways? And of course, everywhere you go in any part of the world, people complain about the state. They complain about what the government is doing and what the government is not doing and what they think the government should do. And of course, politicians around the world are regarded much the same way as politicians in this country. Yet at the same time, I think many people in those countries, they lack a deep appreciation for some of the challenges that you face in a country like South Africa of 2019. And what I want to do this morning is to walk through some ideas about what governments do, what they in principle could do well, how they behave in practice, and what are some alternate solutions for the kinds of problems that government action and government policy is designed to alleviate. Okay. Most people in the US, in Europe, all around the world, not everyone, but you know, kind of the dominant consensus view on the relationship between government and markets and civil society is something like, I mean, many people call it neoliberalism. That word carries a lot of baggage, both pro and con, but it's a useful shorthand for something like a market system with a healthy degree of social democracy, the kind of system that you find in Europe, the kind of system that you find in North America, most parts of the world. A few exceptions. You don't find this in North Korea or Cuba, Venezuela, perhaps. And certainly there are many avowed opponents of this kind of model. But kind of the consensus mainstream view goes something like this. Markets are great, or at least markets are pretty good for some things, right? Two cheers. The American conservative intellectual Irving Kristol, who was one of the founders of the so-called neoconservative movement, wrote a book in the 1980s called Two Cheers for Capitalism. I mean, so I personally am more of a three cheers guy. So to me, this seems a bit weak. This seems like weak tea, but it's meant to capture, again, this sort of consensus view that markets are pretty good for producing shoes, right? Most people, even in poor countries, most people have shoes of some kind, right? And I'm guessing most of the people in this room are fortunate enough to have multiple pairs of shoes. Right? You have shoes for work and shoes for play and shoes for going to the gym and shoes for relaxing at the beach, and you have brown ones and black ones and maybe red and blue and green ones, right? Some people have nicer shoes than other people, right? Some have designer, beautiful leather footwear. Other people have more basic kinds of footwear, but there are not many people, there are some, but there are not many people who are so desperately poor they cannot have any kind of shoes on their feet at all. So most people would say it's okay to let entrepreneurs, the market system, capitalism be responsible for shoes. And maybe to some degree other ordinary items, food, clothing, shelter, automobiles, most technology products. I mean, we've got the computer and projector and screen, and I've got the little clicker here. You don't hear many calls for nationalizing those industries. Wouldn't it be great if the government would be responsible for producing all of the smartphones, PCs, communications devices that we have in our pockets? Not many people think that. Why? Why are markets pretty good, according to most people, at producing sort of ordinary goods and services? Well, we all know that private property, assigning private property titles to land and machines and ideas, in fact, can be beneficial over sort of common public access, right? It makes sense that the farmer who owns his own land is more likely to invest in maintaining the quality of the land, will protect the land from harm from outsiders, keep wild animals away, and so forth. You guys have a whole different category of wild animals to keep away here than we do at my home, where we have small deer and maybe little bunny rabbits that you sort of chase away. We want people to have incentives to maintain not only their personal consumption property, their home, their automobile, and so forth, their shoes, but also productive assets, machines, parcels of land, and so forth. So yeah, allowing people to have private ownership of things, right? Think of a capitalist market system being having private property or private ownership as the foundation. That gives people incentives to do things and work hard and so forth. We want, if people feel like they can keep the fruits of their own labor, or most of the fruits of their own labor, they probably expect to pay some tax or whatever. People will work hard, they'll want to get better, they'll want to go to school, they'll want to learn new skills and so forth, right? If you live in a Marxist economy where the rule is from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, there was a famous socialist writer named Alexander Gray, an English theorist, who said, well, the problem that you have under socialism, who will take out the garbage? Right? Who will be willing to do sort of unpleasant and dirty tasks when there's no remuneration of any kind, right? You get the same amount of food and you live in the same kind of domicile, whether you're a hardworking manager or whether you're the trash collector or whether you do anything. Why bother to work at all? Whereas in a capitalist system, in a system of private property, you can keep most of the fruits of your own labor. That makes people want to do things, want to work hard. We have the price mechanism, right? Those of you who are business practitioners understand, all about the price mechanism and the market system, right? You want to sell where prices are high, and you want to purchase your inputs where prices are low, and prices of different commodities, prices of goods and services, financial market indicators provide information to you about how to sort of structure your affairs and what activities you want to pursue and avoid and so forth. In the absence of a price system, if we lived in an economy where the government owned all the resources and the government made all the decisions about what to do, you couldn't function as an entrepreneur. You couldn't focus as a business professional without being able to buy and sell at market prices. This is kind of Economics 101, or whatever you call your introductory economics course that you had at university maybe a few years ago. For some people, I can see it was many years ago, but you remember this kind of stuff from your professors and the readings. They probably said, markets are on the whole pretty good. We've got to control them. We've got to tame their excesses, and we need wise statesmen to sort of supervise the market, but by and large, you want to let the market work because you get a lot of benefits. They always say, but we do need a strong and reliable government or state. We need a central state, not just your local town council, but we need some kind of large national state level apparatus. Why? Well, a lot of rationales are given, but loosely speaking, you could call them sort of laying out or designing and enforcing the rules of the game. Right? So who gets the property titles to various things? Who is allowed to do these activities and those activities? Who kind of watches out to make sure no one is cheating the system? You need kind of a police force right? To sort of monitor and make sure nobody's cheating, everybody's playing fair. And of course, you need a strong central state for that. And then I'll speak a little bit later about a particular category of goods and services that the textbooks call public goods. Things like education and healthcare and maybe the roads and protection services, et cetera, that it is alleged market actors cannot provide. For various reasons, entrepreneurs are unable to supply these things or to supply them well, and therefore you need the taxpayers acting through the state to sort of provide these things collectively. Education, primary example. Right? I mean, everybody recognizes we have some private education, but in every country in the world, there is a view that at least some fundamental level of education must be provided by the state so that everyone has a fair shot of succeeding in life, regardless of parents' income or well-being, or healthcare, right? We hear this in the West a lot. I'm sure you hear the same kind of ideas here too. You know, healthcare is not a commodity. Healthcare is not a product. Businesses should not get rich from providing health care because health care is a basic human right. Without health care, you can't exist. Scientific discovery is another good or service that is typically described as something the market can't provide. And I've been doing some research in this area, and at the end of the talk, we'll share some ideas about to what extent markets are or are not capable of providing things like basic scientific research. But you see, again, this sort of neoliberal idea is, no, we don't want to go full Marxist. We want to have markets, we just want them to be controlled or regulated or governed by a strong state that can provide these valuable public goods and can kind of maintain order and so forth. In the economics textbooks, some of you can have some flashbacks. Maybe they're emotionally difficult flashbacks to your college days and taking economics courses. Economics textbooks they rarely talk about government failure, but they describe something they call market failure. So market failure is the term that the textbooks use to describe these situations where the market is unable to supply whatever it is we want by itself, and it has to be controlled or steered. The government has to step in. That's the typical phrase. The government has to step in to fix this market excess or to provide this public good or whatever. So the textbooks have stuff like this, which if you think about it is really pretty nonsensical, right? They say, well, markets are great, or they might say, markets maximize social welfare. That's fancy mainstream economics language for markets are great. Right? As long as the following completely unrealistic conditions obtain, all firms face perfectly elastic supply curves and input demand curves. If any of you are coming to the afternoon, the seminar later today, you'll hear more about some of those ideas. Everybody has the same information in the market. There are no unpriced externalities. Government supplies all necessary public goods. In that case, markets are great. Okay, this is all kind of weird jargon, and my point in sharing it is only to convey to you that in the economics textbooks, they prevent a lot of weird jargon as a way of saying, in reality, in the real world, free markets do not maximize social welfare. So all of you crazy market enthusiasts need to tone it down. Yeah, markets aren't horrible, but markets aren't that great, because for them to be great, they'd have to be able to do all these things. Otherwise, the market fails. Most textbooks devote no discussion whatsoever, no pages to the concept of government failure, but many, many pages to the concept of market failure, which includes things like the presence of monopolies and so-called free riding and asymmetric information, some people knowing things that other people don't know. Let that sink in for just a moment. In the textbooks, if you have a society in which one person knows something that another person doesn't know, then you have market failure, and the market doesn't work. Okay. You got all these kind of crazy things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lengthy list of things that are wrong with the market. So what students at most universities Almost all the universities I know in the US, it's probably true in South Africa, get as well if they take an economics course is, again, this idea that, yeah, I mean, markets seem okay. You got private property and incentives and the price mechanism, wow. But I remember we spent weeks talking about market failure so that my enthusiasm would be tempered. And I would remember that, thank goodness, we have wise bureaucrats who can fix all these market failures. That's the basic lesson you get in a lot of economics courses. And it's weird because just in the last few weeks, there's been a wave of criticism from people on the left in the US and in the EU, charging that economics has done great harm because it's too right-wing, and that economists are what they call market fetishists. And I think, well, that doesn't look like any mainstream economics I know, because when I was in school as an undergraduate student and getting a PhD in economics and working as a practicing economist for many years, this was the stuff that almost all my colleagues believed. Markets fail most of the time, that's why you need government. That's the lesson of mainstream economics. A lot of problems with it. One immediate issue that comes to mind, if a student has gone through this course where they've heard all this stuff about market failure, they might be thinking, well, then why do we even have them? If markets fail so often, why don't we abandon what our economics professor was telling us, and why don't we follow the Pied Piper song of a charismatic young politician like Bernie Sanders, who's been arguing for decades that we need to get rid of the market system altogether. He describes himself as a democratic socialist. Exactly what that means in the current political context is a little bit unclear, or you could have the younger version, everyone's favorite congressperson for entertainment value, if nothing else, Representative Ocasio-Cortez of New York. And of course, in the sort of popular imagination and on the world stage, you have people like Greta Thunberg, right, telling us that capitalism and its emphasis on economic growth, or what she called the fairy tale of economic growth, is taking away her childhood. So to Pete, I say, how dare you? That was what she said in her UN speech. We have Antifa type groups, and mainly what they do in the US is go to college campuses and throw rocks and sticks at conservative and libertarian speakers. And sometimes I don't know what they do around here, but you've got a sort of a movement of these kind of crazy far left activist types. We don't have a lot of them in Texas because everyone in Texas carries a gun, so you don't mess with people in Texas. But for some reason, they concentrate all of their protest activity in places like Seattle and Portland, where everyone is sort of a left-wing granola eating type. But you can easily understand the appeal of these kinds of views that say, look, because markets fail all the time, let's just get rid of them. Or let's minimize them. Let's make them as small as possible. Let's let the state do everything. In fact, we see increasing reports, especially among younger voters and younger citizens in the West, and I don't know if it's true in South Africa as well, an increasingly open embrace of various kinds of socialism. And we don't usually use the word communism, but what I would call communism. There was a clever article this is a Columbia Business Review on millennial beliefs called Capitalism, right? So a lot of millennials say they oppose capitalism, and they're in favor of something called socialism. So Generation Z, which I guess is the generation like teenagers and preteens today, people who come after the millennials, they have a more and more positive view of terms like socialism and a more negative view of things like capitalism. It turns out if you look at these surveys more carefully and look at, you ask the respondents, well, what do you think the word socialism means? Very few of them would give what I would consider a classic sort of definition of socialism, right? State ownership of the means of production. That's the Marxist-Leninist version of socialism. The state, the central government, owns all the land, all the natural resources, all of the factories, is in charge of directing everyone's labor, and people go out and function, and they perform various sort of activities under the direction of the state. right? And then the state distributes benefits to people according to some formula or whatever. That's what classic socialism means, as opposed to capitalism, a system of private ownership of the means of production. What most young people think socialism means is just more progressive income taxation. It's a kind of neoliberalism. They don't want state ownership of the means of production. They just want higher tax rates on rich people, and they want more environmental regulation. They want more government intervention and more egalitarian policies, but within a basic capitalist framework. There was one survey that indicated that some young people thought socialism means being sociable. In other words, being nice, like being nice to other people on social media is socialism. Of course, we're for that. We want people to be nice to each other. So I don't want to be too pessimistic about this sort of movement towards socialism. And again, if you ask people like Bernie Sanders or Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez or Greta Thunberg, describe in detail what exactly is the system that you want, you won't get classic Marxist-Leninist socialism. I mean, in some cases, because they would be completely clueless about what those words even mean, because they don't understand what they're talking about. But even among those who do, they probably don't want to go full. I mean, I don't know, Bernie Sanders maybe. This is the guy who spent his honeymoon in Moscow, in the 1950s or 60s or whatever. Bernie probably is pretty red deep down, but I don't think the others really know what they're talking about. As the way I like to say this, without government, how would you perform all these essential tasks and services in the society? Those of you into memes, just search for without government memes, and there's lots of very funny ones of governments doing things that it seems like maybe would be okay without doing. I think that's Justin Trudeau on the left, who's gotten himself into a little bit of difficulty in the last week or so. Poor Mr. Trudeau. So, okay, let me offer a sort of a different view of how to think about these problems and tie back to the themes that Pete raised in his introductory remarks. So the first thing is to recognize that I don't want to be nitpicky on terminology, but there's an important conceptual difference between what we call government and what we might call governance. All right, so think of governance in terms of order, rules, sort of a well-ordered society or well-ordered interactions among persons. So almost everyone, and certainly everyone I know, is in favor of governance in some way. We need we human beings can act in all kinds of ways, and sometimes we don't act we can act badly, and it's nice that there's some constraints that are placed on our behavior such that we can interact and get along and work well as a society. Many people think government means governance, but government, right, is a more formal kind of political science term, right? For government is a particular institution or entity that has a legal monopoly on physical coercion, right? The government can shoot you with a gun. The government can imprison you in a jail cell. And that's different from a private party doing those things. Right, the government has the legal right to do those things, not necessarily in every situation. There was a U.S. politician, a current member of the U.S. House of Representatives called Barney Frank. You may have heard of Barney Frank. He served in the House of Representatives from Massachusetts for a long time. And a few years ago, he said, well, government is the word we use for things that we do together. That's the most ridiculous definition of government ever. I mean, here we're doing a thing together right now. We have several people sitting in an auditorium and a person standing on stage, and we have people with lights and cameras and microphones and so forth, and people who provided water bottles. We're not the government in here, right? So we do lots of things together. That's not government. Government is a specific institution that has this legal monopoly on violence. I want to invoke a distinction that was emphasized by the famous economist and legal scholar and political theorist Friedrich Hayek. an Austrian-born economist and scholar who taught in the UK and in the US, and you probably heard of Hayek. He was a Nobel laureate, won the Nobel Prize in 1974. But one of his later books is called Law, Legislation, and Liberty. And it's kind of an odd title, Law, Legislation, and Liberty. I know we have some lawyers in the room who can relate to this, but what does he mean by distinguishing law from legislation? And that relates to this key point I want to emphasize. Hayek defines law in the following way. He says law refers to purpose-independent rules of just conduct. Law is rules of just conduct. Okay? It is appropriate for a person or a group of people to do this thing, but not to do this other thing. We say you're not allowed to go here, but you are allowed to go there. These rules are purpose independent, meaning that they apply objectively and kind of ex ante to all sorts of people in all sorts of circumstances. You don't make them up as you go along. There's one rule that applies to Pete LaRue and there's one rule that applies to me. Well, then it's not a general rule that is binding upon all of the members of our community. Hayek used the Greek term nomos to refer to this concept of rules, just rules that provide for an orderly society, orderly social interaction. So what jurisprudential theorists call the natural law, right? There are certain ways that human beings interact and have interacted for millennia that were not just sort of made up by us as we sat around and thought about it, but are given by nature, given by God, or given by the nature of human existence. Those of you who, if you're interested in specific bodies of law, so church law or canon law, right, is an example of rules that are supposed to govern the behavior of members of that particular community. The English common law, I'm sorry, I promised I wouldn't say anything too favorable towards the English at an Afrikaner meeting, but my own ancestry is Scottish, so I have the same attitudes towards the English that some of you do. But the English common law is typically described as what is the common law? It's a system of rules and principles and beliefs about how people should relate to each other. That wasn't sort of designed, it wasn't like some common law experts sat down in a big room around a table and thought through all the rules and wrote them down. No, these rules emerged organically over centuries as people were trying to work things out and trying to come up with reasonable solutions to particular kinds of problems. Maritime law, commercial codes are similar in that there's no government agency that controls the high seas, but yet among merchant marines and among sailors, I'll give an example in just a moment, a very old example, have worked out a system of rules and norms that govern their behavior that really doesn't have any controlling authority other than just sort of social convention. In discussing the common law, Hayek emphasized that the common law, these purpose-independent rules of just conduct, they're kind of articulated, they're written down in the context of particular legal disputes, court cases, right? But the goal of the judge or the arbiter or the referee or the elder in resolving those disputes is not to, come up with, not to invent a new rule, but rather to discover the rule that was sort of already there, but maybe hadn't been spelled out in detail in this particular case. It's a little bit like, we think about how we use the word law in physics, right? We don't say that Isaac Newton created the law of gravity, when he watched the apple fall to the ground. No, we say he discovered the law of gravity, meaning these physical laws exist whether we want them to or not, right? Our job is to try to figure out what they are so that we can take advantage of them. But we don't create them ourselves from our own minds. They exist outside of us. So these purpose-independent rules of just conduct are sort of given by the nature of man, the nature of society, or given by a deity or something like that. such that, yeah, we still got to figure out exactly how they apply in particular cases, but we're not making up a new body of rules. We're discovering and articulating a body of rules that already exists, as opposed to legislation, which Hayek defines as the will of the sovereign. The rules that the king makes up, or the president, or the prime minister, or the legislature, or maybe some judges. I saw a fascinating article a couple of days ago about the recent High Court decision in the UK ruling that Boris Johnson's suspension of Parliament was illegal and unconstitutional in the British sense. I don't know how closely you all follow the Brexit debate. I'm following it a little bit, but not that closely. This one particular article was not talking about the merits of the Brexit controversy per se, but pointed out that this judicial decision passed down by the British High Court was very odd in that it did not cite any legal precedent. It didn't cite any other cases where these same kinds of issues have been raised. It didn't refer to any external literature. It simply articulated what the judges thought was right. It reflected the subjective beliefs and will of the judges. Okay, that's not what a common law judge is supposed to do. Common law judge is supposed to say, well, my predecessors trying to work out similar problems decided it this way, and my best interpretation is that it's most like this other case, and this is probably how the common law applies. Apparently, that's not what the British High Court did in this recent decision. Legislation is often described as positive law as opposed to natural law. Again, not to get too technical and legal definitions, but positive law is law that we make up. Rules that we as individuals or groups or people in the government, we just decide this is what the rules should be, as opposed to the natural law, which is outside of our own sort of will. As opposed to canon law and common law and maritime law and so forth, legislation is reflected in statutes and executive orders and bureaucratic mandates and maybe in some judicial decisions like this British one. Right? The idea is that unlike a body of law that exists outside of us and is discovered by us, these are rules that are created by us to achieve specific goals. Created, not by us, but by the state, by the sovereign, by the king, the president, the prime minister, and so forth. Now, you can read the book if you're interested in the relationship between law, legislation, and liberty, but it won't be too much of a spoiler for me to tell you that Hayek argues that a system based on law actually is much superior to a system based on legislation in terms of preserving and protecting human liberty. But I just want to refer you to Hayek, and you can, if you're interested, you can certainly pursue this later. This idea that if we want to have rules that govern an orderly social interaction, we have to look to the state to provide them. That's actually a pretty recent, in human history, that's a recent development. That's a sort of mid-18th century, 19th century view that rules come from the state. Prior to that, most people believed that rules come from God, or rules come from our nature as human beings, or rules are things that we just sort of discover and articulate. So, can markets supply governance in the sense of rules of just conduct? Can markets and capitalism and entrepreneurs, business people, can they supply a form of governance? Well, look, we all are familiar with private governance or non-state governance in lots of areas of our daily interaction, right? Within the family, there are typically some rules that govern relationships between spouses and between parents and children and other family members and so forth. And most people around the world across cultures have remarkably similar views about duties that children owe to their parents and ways that parents ought to behave towards their children and so forth. Yeah, of course, there's some variety across societies, but what's remarkable, if you look across cultures, either contemporary cultures or over time, is there's remarkable unanimity. There's a remarkable amount of conformity about these sorts of things. So these are not rules provided by the state, and the state doesn't tell me how many books I need to read to my small children at night, or exactly how I provide for my children's well-being, but people tend to have remarkably common views about what's appropriate within churches or communities or social clubs and all kinds of associations, private business associations like this one. Right? There's certain rules that operate here. If you're a member of the group, or if you attend an event sponsored by the group, you have to do certain things, and certain things are expected. We're all parts of different kinds of networks, or to use the modern technological term, platforms. We all participate in various platforms that have a number of rules that are not enforced by the state, but yet are very effective in guiding and coordinating our behavior. One interesting example is, where do you get most of your information? When I was a kid, you would rush to the library or to the bookcase and find a thick copy of some kind of encyclopedia. Of course, now kids don't do that. You just Google it, right? But usually you get something like Wikipedia. Let's look at Wikipedia. I just pulled up a completely random Wikipedia entry for us to look at, because Wikipedia has entries on all kinds of topics and all kinds of famous people. And here's one. Raise your hand if you've ever looked at a Wikipedia article. Yeah, everybody, right? The great thing about Wikipedia, it is said, is that anything goes. Sort of. Yeah. But it's not like the old Encyclopedia Britannica or something that I had when I was a kid, where there's an editor of the series who decides how many volumes there will be, and then hires, I guess, junior editors or associate editors in charge of each volume. Somebody's in charge of A through B, and somebody's in charge of C through D, and they decide what topics will be covered, and they find people to write articles on each topic, and they make those assignments, and they read the articles when they come in, and they edit them and revise them and curate, and all of a sudden you get a giant encyclopedia. Wikipedia, of course, is not like that, right? Any person on the internet can create a Wikipedia entry, right? That's why you get Wikipedia entries on all kinds of obscure topics that would not ever make it into the traditional encyclopedia. In fact, there was a point when if you looked at my Wikipedia entry, sometimes they have these little warnings on the top. Have you ever seen those? That this entry is under review, and mine had a thing that said lack of notability of the subject or something like that. Like they were threatening to take it down. I had my students take care of that. But anybody can write one, and there's an edit tab. Anybody can edit one, and you can go back and look at the history of all the different edits and so forth. So you think, gosh, Wikipedia looks like a great example of wide open. It's open source. Anybody can read it, anybody can write it, anybody can revise it. It must be a complete and total mess, right? Of course, it's not a complete and total mess. There are lots of weird entries. And, are there errors in Wikipedia? Sure. Are there errors in the Encyclopedia Britannica? Yes. Are there errors in the New York Times and CNN and the London Times and all of the South African media outlets? Yes. Are there professors at the universities who make mistakes? Yes. The difference between Wikipedia is that the errors tend to get weeded out more quickly, because you have lots of enthusiasts who really care about particular topics, who argue back and forth about these topics, and eventually some kind of consensus emerges. But I actually had a specific thing in mind to share with you. One of the great things about Wikipedia, there are lots of other online sources of information. A lot of us like to use Wikipedia because it's sort of laid out in a nice way. Whether you look at it on a mobile device or on a computer screen, the layout is consistent. There's these links on the left-hand side, and there's the different edit tabs and so forth on the top. And if you scroll on down, there's sometimes a little table of contents for the article, and the links are all done in a certain way. The links to other Wikipedia articles are in one color, and links to outside web links are in another color. And if you look at the edit page, there's certain form of the code that's used for where an experienced person can see who made this edit and what kind of edit it was and so forth. Where did all that come from? It was created by a guy. His name is Jimmy Wales. My computer's not connected to the internet right now, but you can look up later, Jimmy Wales, W-A-L-E-S. He has a title like CEO of the Wikipedia Foundation, but he is the guy who invented Wikipedia. He's the guy who created Wikipedia. Wait, what does that mean? He's the guy who wrote the entry on Peter G Klein and all kinds of other obscure topics? No, he didn't create the content, but he created the form. So the idea of open source software and open source products was already around, but Jimmy Wales figured out, basically he wrote the code for the Wikipedia platform. He designed the format and the layout and the procedures by which people could create entries and revise entries and so forth. And so Wikipedia emerged within a set of rules established by Jimmy Wales, a private actor. He was actually a guy who was a master's student at Auburn University and took a class from our friend Mark Thornton. And Mark Thornton told him about Hayek and the notion of bottom-up rules. And according to Jimmy Wales, he was inspired by those ideas to think, hey, you could create a bottom-up kind of encyclopedia, and Wikipedia is what we've got. So whether it's Facebook or Amazon or Uber, all of these platforms that you're familiar with, they have rules, right? I mean, Facebook has things, their procedures for putting content on and sharing content and so forth. Amazon has rules for how to get your products onto Amazon's platform if you're a seller. How you select, how you sort, how you purchase, how you pay, how things are delivered, right? Platforms like these or Uber, they have very detailed policies and procedures for how people interact on the platform. But these things are not the state, right? These things are providing order of a certain kind in a purely private capitalistic fashion. It turns out that if you look at the sorts of functions that are typically associated with the provision of rules and order and so forth, you find that in almost every case they have been provided and sometimes are currently provided by private actors. I mentioned earlier this sort of commercial law. So during the Middle Ages, as long-distance trade and commerce began to grow across the sort of known world at that time, merchants were dealing with other merchants across long distances. People were going to trade fairs and purchasing goods and services, not from someone else in the village that they knew, but from someone who was otherwise a stranger. How do you resolve disputes in this case? How do merchants mitigate conflict over, did you pay me on time for this stuff that appeared on this caravan or not? And you borrowed some money and no one paid it back. You couldn't go to the village magistrate to resolve that dispute because the traders were often at a long distance. They represented different villages. Well, merchants developed their own commercial code. And it's sometimes called the lex mercatoria in Latin, or the law merchant or merchant law in English. And there were actually individuals. Sometimes the term law merchant refers to individuals who specialized in adjudicating disputes for a fee. And they would show up at the trade fair, or they would show up in a meeting of travelers and say, look, anybody got any conflicts that need to be resolved? I will resolve them for you in exchange for 2 gold coins or whatever. I'll listen to both sides. I'll review the relevant documents. I'll use my knowledge of case law to tell you what I think the resolution should be. And those who had reputations for honesty and fair dealing and so forth tended to attract more business and make more money than others. So you guys are familiar with private arbitration, right? This is like an early medieval version of arbitration, which was actually quite successful. During this trip to South Africa, my wife and I are going to go out to the Cape. We're going to go to Hermanus, where you have, apparently it's peak whale watching season, and my wife is a whale watching enthusiast. I didn't bring any harpoons, but I do want to go out on a boat and see some whales. It turns out that in the 19th century, I guess late 18th, early 19th century, you had a lot of conflict among whalers. Remember, whaling was big business back then because not just the whale meat, but the whale oil was used before the development of kerosene and gasoline for lamps and so forth. And it's not easy to catch a big whale. I mean, I guess this is not I don't know if this is a historically accurate painting or not, but it's not easy to catch a whale because they're big and fast, and there are lots of different kinds of whales. Some of them fight very ferociously at the beginning. Some of them are just very fast. They try to run away. And of course, you had whalers from all different countries, from all different ports of call and all different nationalities out there trying to catch whales. Well, sometimes you need a certain amount of cooperation among different whale hunters to be able to catch and retrieve a whale. The Yale law professor Robert Ellickson has done a fascinating study of the emergence of whaling rules in the Atlantic Ocean in the early 19th century. And it turns out that, I don't know if any of you here are whaling experts, you may be able to fill in some additional detail, but there were very complicated rules about which whaler was entitled to the ownership of the whale carcass once it was caught. Because again, I say sometimes you had multiple ships working at the same time. And the rules were developed to kind of incentivize people to participate in whale hunting in a way that provided benefits for the whaling community as a whole. So for example, for whales that were very fast and it took a long time for them to sort of wear down and be capturable, the rule was once a whale was captured and brought to a ship, ownership of the whale belonged to whichever whaler's harpoon was in the whale first. So of course, people had identifying marks on their harpoons. They had their brand on the harpoon. And so if I'm the first one to get a harpoon in that whale, but then it swims away and I'm not able to catch it, somebody else later finds it almost, near death and hauls it in, the whale actually belongs to me, not the person who found it, but the person who effectively killed it by putting in the first harpoon. Without a rule like that, if a fast whale swam by, no one would have an incentive to go after it because you probably wouldn't be the one to capture it. Someone else would capture it. But it made sense, and the whalers implicitly agreed, okay, for these kinds of whales, we'll give ownership or most of the ownership to the person who took the risk to go out and give it a go, even if someone else eventually hauled it in. For the slow, lumbering types of whales that were relatively easy to catch, ownership of the whale belonged to the ship that was able to haul in the whale. The point is, there were very detailed rules that applied in different cases that were well known and well understood among the whalers, even though they were of different nationalities. They had different home ports of call. There was no government agency that controlled any of this. But on a purely voluntary basis, professional whalers developed and abided by these rules of conduct because it made for better whaling, made for a more successful whaling business. They engaged in good governance without government. Okay, so finally, I want to wrap up here. What about these so-called public goods, law and order, protection against assailants and dispute resolution? What about infrastructure, roads and bridges and dams and power plants, education, healthcare, scientific discovery, and so forth? Well, there are lots of books and articles that you can read on this. I mean, I think the best way to say it now, to put it simply, is that every one of these goods and services has at some time in history, and in many cases at this time in history, been provided by various kinds of private actors, right? You know this well in your country, even better than people know it in my country, because you have private security services. We have what we call gated communities in the U.S. where there's a neighborhood and it's behind a wall and you have to go through a gate with a guard, but not the way you have, okay? You have them on a whole number, you have it up to 11, as they say, here in South Africa, and you have plenty of private security services that are provided by non-state actors. We already talked about adjudication and other forms of private dispute resolution, arbitration, and so forth. Of course, roads, bridges, railway lines, air transportation, those have historically been provided by all kinds of actors, oftentimes states, but many times the state just comes along and appropriates private infrastructure that's already been built. No reason to think that private actors can't build roads and bridges and so forth. Education and healthcare, yeah, of course, these are in fact provided in many cases by the state or state actors, but they're also provided by private actors, private schools, private and community hospitals, and so forth. In the interest of time, I'll skip the details on scientific discovery, but simply point out that most of what the government does in promoting sort of basic science turns out to be, again, sort of the government stepping in after much of the science has already been done and claiming responsibility for it. Even the things, the so-called public goods, typically are provided by private communities, markets, private actors, entrepreneurs, business people, and so forth. And there are lots of reasons to think that market provision would be more economically efficient than state provision. The market system itself, the system of prices and property rights and buying and selling and production and distribution is itself a kind of example of a non-state order, right? Hayek used the term spontaneous order, which may or may not be the best term, right? But the market system is an example of how the global market system, right, which has no global government controlling it, is an example of how people can cooperate and interact in an orderly fashion without the threat of sort of the legal monopoly of violence. In most cases, the best rules are those that emerge organically bottom up rather than being imposed top down. So, to answer the question that we started with, when governments fail to various degrees, it doesn't follow that markets, societies, communities must also fail, because markets, societies, and communities are often providing an alternative set of institutions. We are providing these kinds of things that the state sometimes provides and often claims to be the only legitimate provider of. In fact, we can handle many of those things through private voluntary action. So the market is capable of doing much more than the economics textbooks often imply. And one of the great things about organizations like yours is that you have business people, yourselves and your colleagues, who are already skilled at providing various kinds of goods and services under private rules. And there's so much more that we can do and things that we can do better, even when the government is not doing the things it claims that it is able to do.
How would perfect market or markets in this case address issues of monopolistic tendencies?
Yeah, it's just a great question, and there are increasing calls in the U.S. from people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and so forth to be more aggressive towards the so-called tech monopolies, Amazon, Google, Facebook. So it's very interesting. Earlier in the discussion of Hayek, I referred to this distinction between nomos and thesis, or sort of rules of just conduct and the specific will of the legislator. So the common law notion of monopoly, what the word monopoly initially meant was not a firm with a large market share, right? Monopoly meant an exclusive privilege granted by the state, right? So the Dutch East India Company had a monopoly on trade between Europe and the East Indies, right, in the 17th, 18th century. That doesn't mean that, they had 52% of the market. It means that it was literally against the law. It was illegal for anyone else to get spices in Indonesia or whatever and bring them to the home country. You would be shot dead by the Royal Navy, right? Nowadays, you see in some European countries, you're shopping through the airport at Heathrow and you buy a little souvenir, some candy, and at the bottom it says, by royal, what is it, royal provision to Her Majesty or whatever. So in the old days, the king would say, okay, you're the only one who can produce bread, and you're the only one who can sell fish and so forth, and different groups or maybe different merchants or maybe groups of merchants, merchant guilds, would be given an exclusive government license to engage in a certain trade, and no one else could do it by pain of death or imprisonment or whatever. So nowadays we sometimes have that. I mean, we talk about in different countries, maybe there's a train monopoly, meaning that there's one company that might be formally incorporated as a private company with shareholders, but it has exclusive legal right to deliver passenger train service. You don't have free and open competition. You have the state picking one company and saying, only you get to do it. That's the traditional notion of monopoly. Nowadays, the word monopoly means big company, right? So when Elizabeth Warren says, we've got to break up the tech monopolies, we've got to break up Google. Google should be legally separated into 5 different companies or 10 different companies or whatever. Well, I mean, what is the activity over which Google has a legal monopoly? I mean, it's not search, right? You got Microsoft Bing, which nobody uses, and there's DuckDuckGo if you're concerned about privacy. I mean, there's hundreds of search engines. It's just most of them are not that good. So the vast majority of people, I mean, none of the others except Google have been made into a verb. Okay. Facebook has a very large market share in social media, but it's actually been shrinking a little bit. Younger people are not using Facebook anymore. It's old people like most of us, right, are using Facebook. Apple doesn't have. So none of these so-called monopolies of today are monopolies in the classic sense. They're just firms that are big. They're firms that have a very large share of the market. So if you ask me what should be done about it, I often show my students a great article that I saved from 1998 by an unfortunate journalist named, I think Victor Keegan is his name. It was an article from some tech publication. The headline, "Will MySpace ever lose its monopoly?" Anybody remember what MySpace is? The young folks don't remember. That was like a Facebook predecessor. That was like the Facebook of the late 90s. And I don't know, had 90% of the market share for that kind of a thing, whatever it was back then. So what happened? It wasn't good. People invented other platforms that users preferred, and they switched to these newer platforms. What should be done about Facebook? Nothing. Don't grant Facebook any special legal privileges. Now, there's some debate in the US, and the lawyers might want to talk about this over whether these platforms, social media platforms, should be treated as so-called common carriers, where they're not legally responsible for what users post, as opposed to being treated as publishers, where they may have some, liability for offensive material published on their platforms. So as long as we don't grant them any special privilege, what will happen is the market will discipline their behavior. Apple has a large market share among young people, a slightly smaller market share at large. What are the others? Google. I mean, Google has grown because it works well. People like the goods and services that Google offers. Now, people complain about them. Increasingly, we hear complaints about privacy and so forth. It's another topic. I mean, if I really am concerned that I don't want Google to know my location, I can turn all my location services off on my phone, which doesn't completely get me in the clear. I can just not use Google services. I can only use DuckDuckGo for my search engine. I can use other providers of maps and so forth. I can take actions to try to make my digital footprint smaller. Almost nobody does that, even people who know how to do it, because it's not worth it. I mean, they prefer the benefits, the convenience of being able to use those products and services over these sort of privacy concerns. So again, there's nothing there's nothing saying that in a free market all the firms will be the same size. No, I mean, we would expect some to be better than others, and some to have different growth aspirations than others. As long as anyone is legally free to give it a shot, to compete against the incumbents, then you have a competitive market.
So it's just a thought from my side that shouldn't the markets be organizing themselves to protect themselves against the government?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not an expert in the particular tactics that will work in various contexts to do exactly what you accomplish. So there's lots of different strategies for accomplishing the aim of facilitating private governance and reducing the footprint of the state, or being less dependent on the state. There's education, the kind of thing we're doing now, just talking about it, thinking through the ideas, writing articles and books, talking to your friends. There are more radical approaches that various people have proposed. Again, no one in my community is advocating, blowing up train tracks or something, right? But so for example, think of the cryptocurrency movement. A lot of people think, well, if we could just get more use of Bitcoin and other private kinds of mechanisms, and of course, crypto technologies or blockchain technologies can be used for writing and enforcing contracts and engaging in all kinds of business activities kind of outside the formal financial system and judicial system. And I think that's great. I mean, I'm very happy to see all of the experimentation in that space. Is that ultimately a way to kind of circumvent the formal institutions of commerce and so forth, the legal institutions? I don't know. It might be, and I think it varies widely by context. Probably in the U.S., for example, despite the inefficiency of the court system, despite the inefficiency of the formal financial system, most people, it's like Google versus DuckDuckGo. Most people are probably unwilling to switch to an alternative, less well-known, more experimental approach, like a blockchain technology. But in other parts of the world, I won't mention any countries by name that start with S and A, for example, there might be a greater willingness to experiment with these kind of private alternatives. So, in other words, education, conversation, thinking about ideas, trying to persuade people is one tactic. Another tactic is to invest in alternative technologies and just sort of circumvent or bypass the existing ones. You don't have to have a philosophical conversation with anybody to get them to join you. You just show them on your device, hey, look at this cool thing you can do. You can get your money faster. You can make an international payment much more easily than if you go through the formal system. That's also great. And yes, there are people in the pro-market movement who dress in black and have ponytails and have more radical strategies and so forth, but I don't have any particular comment on how effective those might be.
Peter, not everything, of course, is about evolves around profit. So it's an essential ingredient, but it's not the whole story. And so when government fails, markets don't have to. We can create coordination and orderly mechanisms. But the rest of society doesn't always function on a sort of profit motive. And especially in South Africa, you see this flourishing of we could call them the private, they're not state, but they're also not guided by the profit motive. There's non-market, so maybe it's sort of just serving the public good in many respects. What sort of complementarities are there between markets and the rest of that social component?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we've mostly been talking about market institutions and the profit and loss system and so forth because you're a community of people engaged in market activity. But really, a more general distinction, you could refer to the sort of the sphere of the state, where you have this sort of formal mechanism of coercion, and then what you might call the voluntary sector, right? So the free society, or the free and voluntary interaction among persons, which includes not only kind of market-based activity with exchange, buying and selling, and price mechanism, profits and losses, but also philanthropy and what goes on inside the family and the church and so forth. And I think that market-like mechanisms, incentives, prices, property rights, and so forth, that is one set of instruments that can be used within the voluntary sector, but by no means the only one. And I think these mechanisms are sort of complementary. I sometimes illustrate this with a child-rearing example. Those of you who are parents, how do you govern things inside the home? What kind of market mechanisms do you use? When my children were small, you, of course, want to train your children to use the toilet We call it potty training in the US. I don't know what you call it here. So there are lots of different strategies of potty training, lots of different techniques or tactics that people can use. So there are, one tactic is what you might call moral exhortation, where the parent says to the child, "You're a big boy now. You don't need to wear a diaper. You're a big boy. You can go by yourself on the potty like a big kid. That'll make mommy and daddy so proud. You're too big to be wearing a diaper. You can talk and you can exhort and you can persuade, and I don't know, sometimes it works and sometimes it's not. We certainly did some of that, but my children, having 2 economists for parents, we also used, the market to some degree. So we had M&Ms, little candies. You get an M&M for every successful trip, right? And you can adjust the price of M&Ms depending on how intensely the reward system in terms of the number of M&Ms. So we used extrinsic incentives, but also intrinsic incentives as well. And we viewed them as complements rather than substitutes. Think about the workplace. I mean, not everything is priced. Your employees, if you have someone who works for you in sales, probably that person is paid on some kind of commission basis. And the more they work, the harder they work, the more merchandise they can sell, the greater the amount of salary or bonus payment they get. But also within a workplace, there's a lot of, hey, stop acting like that. That's wrong. You're causing trouble in the workplace. You're causing, disharmony. That's not appropriate behavior. Come on, don't do that. I mean, I have a managerial position in my department at my university, and I have a mix of different instruments available to me to try to make things work well. And some of them are just talking to people, would your mother approve if she knew you were doing that? Okay, that's all private, voluntary, free, non-coercive, but I'm not using cash, right? But we do have other things. Hey, if you make these a compliment, you get a cash bonus. So these things they work well as complements. So nothing that we're saying here about the market system implies that everything that people do in their communities, in their families, in their churches, in their societies must be done on a strict kind of market basis with prices and extrinsic incentives. Not at all. I mean, most of our daily interactions with other people are not kind of on a market basis. But again, to me, the term, when I talk about markets or the free market system, I just mean the voluntary sector. People are free to buy and sell, to engage in commerce if they like, but they're also free to give their stuff away. They're also free to interact with people on sort of a non-market basis. Again, the key is the absence of sort of coercion from the state, compelling you to act in a certain way at the force, with the threat of legally sanctioned violence if you fail to act in that way. There's a variety of free and voluntary mechanisms that can be used, and people tend to work this out in practice, which ones work best in which circumstances.
Hartlike welkom by Sakeliga. Sake wat? Goeie vraag. Ek sal verduidelik. Sakeliga is eintlik baie eenvoudig. Dit is 'n markplein aanlyn. Lys jou besigheid, lok nuwe klante, kry sakevennote, kom bymekaar in sakekamers en nog baie meer. Om te sien wat Sakeliga en sy mense vir jou kan doen, registreer vandag jouself of jou besigheid op sakeliga.com. Sakeliga. Skep waarde, maak wins.